I will tell you that if you came to the lecture yesterday, then you got some of what I'm going to talk about tonight, because I couldn't give you a brief history of Korea without talking a little bit about the Korean War, but I didn't go into any detail about it. And today, this afternoon, I'm going to be able to give you a lot more detail and some surprises, you know, so brace yourselves. All right. Part of what I talked about before was that in 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War was conducted between Sino, meaning China, and Japan. And no one expected that Japan would be successful in fighting against China, because they were the giant, the historic power in the East, and yet it only took Japan 6 months to defeat China. The primary reason for that conflict was over control of Korea. Korea had been batted back and forth quite a bit, despite their sort of independent nature, and so Korea was controlled primarily in the up until the late 1890s and mid 1890s by China. But Japan was in search of the various kinds of minerals and resources that they needed in order to grow in the way they wanted to. They wanted to be able to develop a powerful navy and military. They wanted to become an industrial nation, but they had no oil, no coal, no iron. And so they looked to Korea for that. So they fought a war, a 6-month war, starting in 1894 against China. They won that war, and in the process, they took over from China the general control of Korea. Now, they didn't immediately sort of subsume or annex Korea. They just moved in and began to influence the Korean culture. They assigned a regent and they assigned a council to begin to run things in Korea, and then they slowly started to institute various kinds of reforms. And as I said yesterday, some of the early of those reforms sounded like pretty good ideas. They abolished slavery in Korea, they got rid of child marriage, they gave women who had been widowed the right to marry again, so some of these sounded pretty good. But in fairly short order, the Japanese began to, in small ways at first, but then in bigger and bigger ways, systematically begin to try to sweep away the Korean history and culture. They forbade or abolished the Confucian thought, which was foundational. I mentioned when we talked about the history of Korea, both Korean shamanism, Confucianism, and Buddhism have all contributed to the culture of Korea. They closed the newspapers. They eventually stopped the study of Korean culture and history in school and replaced it with the study of Japanese history and culture. They began to take land away from Korean farmers and give it to Japanese farmers who were being asked to move there. They inaugurated Japanese businesses, which they gave great financial benefit to if they would establish themselves in Korea. And in doing so, they then put huge tariffs and taxes in order to make it impossible for Korean businesses to compete with them. The Korean Army eventually was disbanded. Now, this is all in the first 15 years or so that they began to have control. Then in 1910, Japan decided to get rid of all pretense, and they annexed Korea. They actually took it over entirely. At that point, we begin what's called the Colonial Period, which lasted from 1910 to 1945. 1945, of course, being when the Japanese were defeated and were no longer in control of Korea or anywhere else other than their own home islands. But during that period of time, in the Colonial Period, there was such oppression that there began to be protests. In 1919, there were protests all over Korea against the control of the Japanese council and regent and military. And the Japanese responded by crushing that opposition and arresting and executing thousands of people, which they demonstrated they were not interested or willing to accept any kind of protest. During the same period of time, China and Japan started having further problems because Japan, now feeling their oats, they moved in and eventually in the early 30s took over the Manchurian state or area of China and renamed it Manchukuo. Well, at that point, there was the beginning of ongoing fighting between the Chinese and the Japanese, which got much worse later, but they began to take Korean men. The Japanese would take Korean men and either force them to fight in the front lines, or they would force them into labor. Because their army was in the field in China, and they also were in Korea, just controlling the country. They took tens of thousands of Korean women and forced them to be what they called comfort women, which were basically sex slaves for the military. They were forced to provide sexual services to the Japanese military in China and in Korea. It got especially bad in the 30s because of the rise of the very militant, imperialistic kind of government in Japan. Everything got worse then. And Korea was seen as being primarily a source for labor and for resources and for food. The average consumption of rice, which is the dominant part of the meals in Korea, dropped by 35% for the average Korean because all of the food was being taken and sent to Japan or to the military in China. And then as they approached the heaviest part of the Second World War, Japan actually went so far as to forbid the use of the Korean language. School children were not allowed to speak Korean language either in school or at home. They were forbidden from that. They forced the attendance to Shinto shrines, Shinto being the historic religion of the Japanese people. It's the folk religion of Japan, and they were forcing the Koreans to attend Shinto services. In every way possible, they were trying to destroy the Shinto culture. They even went so far as to mandate at one point that the Korean people had to take Japanese names. They could no longer use Korean names. That continued all the way up until the end of the Second World War and the defeat of Japan in 1945. I'm going to step aside a little bit and give you a little more history of what was going on in that region leading up to the Korean War. The Japanese had defeated Russia. They defeated China in 1894-95, and they defeated Russia, to everyone's astonishment, in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905. If you heard my first lecture, I talked about all of those. But that wasn't really the end of it. Because the Japanese were in China controlling Manchukuo, there continued to be cross-border flare-ups between the Russians and the Japanese. Well, as they got further into the 30s, and Russia realized, at first they were enemies, then they were friends, then they were enemies again with the Germans. Hitler betrayed Stalin, I won't get into all of that, but eventually they decided that Russia didn't want to have to worry about flare-ups with Japan and possibly war in the Far East because he had to worry about Germany. Well, Japan was interested in being able to go further south into Indochina and other areas and then fight the Pacific War, so they didn't want to have to worry about fighting the Russians. So in 1941, Russia and Japan signed a neutrality pact that they would not fight each other. And that went along for quite a while, but in fact, Stalin maintained a real neutrality with Japan until the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point in the Russian battle against the Germans. They defeated them at Stalingrad and started to push them back, and at that point, Stalin felt like he could breathe a little easier. In fact, he began to realize that, okay, we're having success now on our Eastern Front, which was the battle that they had against the Germans. I don't want to completely give up, or Western Front, excuse me, I don't want to completely give up any possible gains that we might later make in the Far East. Stalin, as evil a man as he was an extraordinary strategic thinker. He always had a plan, and he was an extraordinary manipulator of circumstances and of people. So he began, after the Battle of Stalingrad, despite the fact that he had a neutrality pact from 1941 on with Japan, he began to put troops and supplies in the east in preparation for, he thought, an eventual war to take over more of the eastern border of Russia or Soviet Union, as well as the West. As the Japanese were losing the war, they kept hoping that they could get help from Stalin, that the Soviet Union, while they didn't expect them to fight for them against their allies, they thought that maybe Stalin would be able to negotiate a better peace agreement, because the one thing they didn't want was an unconditional surrender. Japan felt if we have to surrender unconditionally, then they will get rid of the emperor, they'll get rid of our culture, that we as a nation will be destroyed. It didn't turn out that way, by the way. They did surrender unconditionally, but they were respected by the Allies. But they kept going to Stalin and saying, would you negotiate a better agreement, anything other than an unconditional surrender for us? Stalin, in his manipulative thinking, he thought, I need for the Pacific War, that is the war with Japan, the United States, I need for that to go on as long as possible, because I don't want to have to invade anywhere in the East while I'm still fighting the Germans, because I don't have to fight a two-front war. And so while the war was still happening in Europe, and the Russians were involved there, Stalin was actually giving military intelligence and other intelligence assets to the Japanese, because he was trying to make the Pacific War last longer. He thought, if I can keep that war going until we defeat the Germans, then I can deal with the stuff there. But if the Pacific War ended early, he felt like he'd be cut out of any gains that the Soviet Union might make in the East. Does that make sense? So he's providing intelligence to the Japanese in their battle against the other allies secretly, and at the same time he's hoping the war will go longer until he defeats the Germans. He succeeds in that, and yet the Japanese had taken that as a sign of goodwill from Stalin, and so they kept hoping that Stalin would help them get a better surrender deal. It didn't happen. In fact, in April of 1945, the Russians told Japan that they were not going to renew the pact, the neutrality pact, that they were going to let it expire. The Japanese did not know that in 1943 at the Tehran Conference and in 1945 at the Yalta Conference, Stalin had promised Churchill and FDR, and later Truman, that he would come into the war with the other allies against Japan within 3 months of the defeat of Germany. He didn't want to fight a two-front war, but 3 months after they defeated Germany, he would declare war against the Japanese. And he did exactly that to the day, almost to the hour. The defeat of Germany, 3 months later, we get into the August 8th. 3 months before that, the Germans had been defeated in 1945. And so on August 8th, Soviet Union, much to the surprise of the Japanese, declares war against the Japanese, fulfilling his promise to the Western Allies. He invades that same day, practically within an hour of letting the Japanese know that they were now in a state of war. They crossed the border. The Russian military, and that you see here, this is sometimes called the Soviet-Japanese War. It's sometimes called the Battle of Manchuria, sometimes Operation August Storm. Has a number of different names, and they don't often talk about it, but the Russians, as you can tell from this map up here, were not messing around when they decided that they were going to invade Manchuria and take over the area from the declare war on the Japanese. So they invaded on 3 fronts. Now, at the same time that the discussions at Yalta and Tehran had been going on, they had agreed, the Allies had agreed that after the war, because Korea had been so completely devastated and controlled by Japan, they felt some effort would need to be made to bring Korea along, to get them to the place where they could reestablish their own independence, recreate their own government, and all of those things that have been taken away from them. So an agreement was struck that the USSR in the north and the USA in the south would share trusteeship or custodianship, they called it sometimes, meaning they would move into Korea, make sure the Japanese were completely gotten rid of, calm any of the problems that might be occurring there in order to get them back on their feet. They thought that was a great idea. The Koreans were not so keen on that idea, as it turned out. But the Russians, when they invaded on August 8th, by August 10th, within 2 days, their mechanized divisions had gotten down to the northern part of, Korea, here. And they're invading, and there are no U.S. troops there to speak of. And so the U.S. is saying, it looks like Stalin is wanting to take over all of Korea. As they were now, the Cold War was just beginning. The Allies were just beginning to understand Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe, that he had no intention of reestablishing democratic governments, even in those countries that had had democratic governments before. They were to become part of the satellite nation to the Soviet Union. Well, they immediately thought he was doing the same thing here. The U.S. get two colonels, I mentioned before, Dean Rusk, who later became Secretary of State under Kennedy and Johnson, and also another colonel named Charles Bonesteel. They were given the very quick assignment of figure out where we're going to draw a line that the Russians will control north of that, will control south. They came up with the 38th parallel because that roughly divides the country in half. Well, they went to the Russians, went to Stalin, the United States did, and said, okay, the line is at the 38th parallel. You need to stop your troops at the 38th parallel until we can get there. To their amazement, Stalin agreed, and he kept his word. The Soviet troops got to the 38th parallel, which is just north of, not too far north of Seoul, and stopped. And they waited there for several weeks for the Americans to land troops in Korea and then march north to the 38th parallel. And so we established that boundary at that point on the 38th parallel. So this is what it looked like. North Korea, or the northern part of Korea, wasn't called North Korea yet, was controlled at that point by the Russians. The southern part of Korea was controlled by the Americans. Well, I say controlled by. In the north, the Russians clearly did control it. They were looking for some way to establish a communist government. Stalin had the very clear idea that he wanted communism to be the dominant political system all over the world. That was part of the goal of Stalinist communism, Marxist-Leninist Stalinist communism. So he started looking around, he and his other leaders started looking around for someone that they could put in position that would do what they wanted. They had several candidates who were very popular in the north, some of them even communists, but when they gave them orders as to what you're going to do, several of them said, no, that's not how we're going to do it. We're going to do it a different way. And those people disappeared. Anytime there was any sense of opposition in the north, the Russian military crushed it. So they had very little problems in the north. In the south, when the United States came in and they had the United States armed government that was supposed to be helping Korea get back on its feet, the South Koreans, their response was, our country has been in existence for over 4,000 years. Remember, 2333 BC is when they believe they started. And we don't need you here. Get out. There were riots, there were violence, there were communist sympathizers who were trying to undermine any of the efforts that they made there. Jeju, which we just left, there was a major rebellion that happened on Jeju Island. And I've read two different numbers, and it's because whenever something like this happens, you get very different reports. One statistic I read was that 30,000 people were killed by South Korean military for rebellion on Jeju. Another one was 14,000. At any rate, for an island that size, it was a huge, I think they only had 300,000 people then. It was a huge issue. In fact, the U.S. military finally had to step in and say, stop killing people. You know, they were doing almost mass executions of anyone that they thought was guilty of not wanting to go along with the plans. So for all of that, in the south, there was great confusion. And in the north, the Russians were supposed to be cooperating with the Americans to figure out how quickly, and they said it could not be more than 5 years, how quickly they could give Korea back its independence as one nation. Well, because of all the problems that were happening in the south, the Russians kept saying, no, we're doing fine up here, you guys have a problem. And so they would not agree. They were negotiating, they were meeting, but they would not agree to have elections. They would not agree to unify the two halves. And they kept finding excuses. Finally, the United States said, okay, United Nations, solve this problem for us. And so the UN made a proposal for a Korea-wide federal election. The North said no. So what happened is in 1948, because they needed to move forward somehow, in the South, they had elections of a parliamentary body, and that parliamentary body then selected Syngman Rhee as their new president. In the North, the Russians had a communist-style election, which meant they picked the candidates. There was nobody that was not their chosen people. So that by the end of 1948, we had a government in the north that is a communist government led by Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung had been a captain in the Soviet army, only a captain. He was not known as a political figure, but he was somebody that the Russians could control. And so they put him in position as the leader. In the south, Syngman Rhee was creating all sorts of difficulties too. He, right after taking office, he declares martial law. He starts arresting anybody who's critical of him or of the new government. And South Korea went through a number of different administrations, as I talked about in the history, that were either from military coup, declaring martial law, trying to rewrite the constitution to give the military general, who is now the leader, more power, all sorts of things. So this split was creating all kinds of problems, and yet, true to their word, both the United States and Soviet Union left Korea, Soviet Union in late 1948, the US in 1949, and left them to their own devices, with the country split in two between North and South. Now, the war hadn't happened yet. We're up to 1949. But in 1949, another very critical thing happened, and that is that the Communist Party of China, the CPC, was victorious over the nationalist or Kuomintang Party in mainland China. They controlled the whole of the mainland, and the nationalists or Kuomintang were forced to move to Taiwan, so that you had the People's Republic of China, which is communist under Mao Zedong, in the mainland, and on the island of Taiwan, you've got the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, who had been the generalissimo, the military political leader. So at that point, 1949, all of China has become communist. So you've got and they had modeled this on the Soviet Union. They were really inspired by the Soviet Revolution in 1917, the 19-teens. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in 1949. It's also important to note that during the Chinese Civil War, North Korea, which had been around for a few years now, again, the Russians were controlling it, both North Korea and the Soviet Union had been very helpful to the communist Chinese. They had provided them weapons, especially from the north, even from Russia, but even North Korea had provided at one point 2,000 rail cars full of supplies to the communist army who was fighting a civil war in China. So Mao Zedong felt an obligation both to the North Korean communists and to Stalin. Well, Stalin is playing his cards here, and he's telling Kim Il-sung what to do, and he's playing on the fact that Mao Zedong owed them and also still needed them. You know, Mao Zedong and Communist China, even though they won in 1949, they didn't have all their ducks in a row. They still needed a lot of help. And that help was to come from Joseph Stalin and from the Soviet Union. Well, one of the things that Kim Il-sung did was he went to Stalin in 1949 and said, I want to invade the South. I want to conquer the southern part of Korea, the democratic southern part of Korea, and I want to turn it all into one nation again. We have a unified Korea under a communist government, and even though that's exactly what Stalin wanted, Stalin said, no, it's not time yet. And this was in early 1949. A little over a year and a half later, in 1950, Stalin, because Kim Il-sung kept asking, Stalin said, okay, things have changed. All of the Americans are now out of Korea, and one of his greatest fears was that this could lead to a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. He didn't want that. He said, all the Americans are out of Korea. The fact that the Americans did not intercede in China to stop the victory of the Communist Party means Stalin said, I don't believe that they're going to intercede against the communists in Korea. Plus, third and most importantly, the Soviet Union had succeeded in testing their own nuclear weapon. So it was no longer the Soviet Union's, Stalin being concerned that if we go to war with the US, they have nuclear weapons and we don't. So all those factors, by late 1950 or mid-1950, he said, it's time. You can invade. I give you permission. But, he said, if you do invade and you run into problems, don't expect the Soviet Union military, the Red Army, to come in and help you. You're going to have to get help from Mao, from the Chinese. And again, Mao owed Stalin a favor. Mao owed the North Koreans a favor. So when Kim Il-sung asked Mao Zedong, if we enter into this war to try to turn all of Korea into one communist country, if we need help, will you help us? And Mao said yes. Although nobody else knew that, other than Stalin at that point. So, in 1950, there is finally, with the approval of Stalin, the North Korean military, under Kim Il-sung, launched an attack across the 38th parallel, which was the dividing line still, although it wasn't the demilitarized zone that it is today, it was the boundary. They launched an attack across the entire of the 38th parallel. And they immediately, they already had an idea, this is why Kim Il-sung was anxious to invade. There had been some cross-border skirmishes between the North Korean military and the Republic of Korea in the south, the ROK army, and it felt to Kim Il-sung clear that the North Korean military was much more proficient and powerful than the South Korean military. Well, it proved that he was right, because when they crossed the border up here, across the 38th parallel, which is actually this line here, and started pushing down against the Republic of Korea and the very few advisors that were American there, they crushed them. The South Korean military did not hold their ground. In fact, in very short order, they got pushed all the way down here to this little corner. Busan, or Busan as it's called now, which is where we're going tomorrow, was the only main city, port city in this area, and they got crushed into that little area. Well, when this happened, the United Nations said this is an act of aggression. And the UN called on all of its member nations to contribute in an effort to stop this aggression. 16 countries sent troops of some numbers, but by far the majority, 88% of the troops that came to the aid of South Korea at this point were Americans, because President Truman had declared his intention to contain the spread of communism. And this was a blatant example of communism spreading. And so he committed the Army, Navy, and Air Force to South Korea in order to stop this, infringing on the democratic Southern Korean people. Well, because the U.S. had committed so many troops, so many of the troops, 88%, they told the Americans, the UN told the Americans, you can appoint whoever you want as the commander-in-chief of these UN forces. And so they appointed General Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, of course, he had been the senior commander of the Army in the Far East. He had been on the Philippine Islands, had been thrown off by the Japanese. He had been in Australia. He was part of the fight back to take back the Australian islands. He was the one that received the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri battleship. And I'm going to talk about him in a few minutes in a little more detail. He became, and he was the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan. He really was the ruler in Japan for the several years after 1945. He still kept that role, but they asked him to take over responsibility for the Korean War as well. So the North Koreans have come down on June 25th of 1950. By September, they've controlled all of this area, but Douglas MacArthur comes along, and against a lot of people's recommendations, by the way, in fact, Omar Bradley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and head of the Army, he said, we will never have another major amphibious landing like we did at D-Day, or anywhere close to it. They don't, they're too costly. Well, MacArthur decided to do an amphibious landing. And so while most of the UN and Allied troops were down here in the Busan corner, he landed troops on September 15th at Incheon, very close to Seoul. They immediately took Seoul. They cut off the North Korean armies that were south of that. 125,000 members of the North Korean military were captured, and they began from there pushing north. So that September, November of 1950, they pushed all the way up to the Yalu River here, and in November of 1950, they were moving all the way up into the very northernmost regions of Korea. In fact, Douglas MacArthur, who was never one to shy away from publicity, announced through the American media that our troops will be home by Christmas. He says this in November. Well, unfortunately for him, the Chinese, remember Mao had promised to help the North Koreans if they ran into problems. The North Koreans decided, the North Koreans were in trouble, but the Chinese launched 180,000 troops across the Yalu River, completely surprising the United Nations forces under General MacArthur. It ended up being, as I'll talk about later, something of an embarrassment to MacArthur, because just a couple of days before that, he had flown over the front lines and said, I see no evidence that there's going to be any major counterattack, so we don't need to either advance or retreat, we're fine. There's no danger. 2 days later, 180,000 Chinese communists come across the border, and they then start pushing as you see over here, they start pushing the UN troops back south, and they push them all the way down past the 38th parallel and all the way past Seoul. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, changed hands 4 times in this conflict. Well, we're into 1951 now, down here, and they continued to fight and battle, and finally the UN forces were able to push them back up to right where they all started, the 38th parallel. That became things stagnated at that point. There were flare-ups, there were little battles across the border and that sort of thing, but nothing could really be done at that point. Neither side had the resources or the ability to push them on from that point. And so the war continued in kind of a stagnant form. There would be battles. Sometimes Korea is called the Forgotten War, sometimes it's called the Meat Grinder War, because there was this sense in which the troops were being just chewed up whenever they had a battle, and yet they weren't gaining anything. So the 38th parallel became their stopping place. And now I have a special story for you. One of the things that happened is when the UN troops got up here to the Yalu River, and then they were attacked by 180,000 Chinese troops and driven back, there were 100,000 troops at that point from the UN, mostly Americans, who needed to be evacuated by sea because they were under assault from the Chinese and the North Koreans at that point. And they needed to save those troops because they needed them elsewhere in terms of in the army. This is a ship called the SS Meredith Victory. The SS Meredith Victory is a U.S. merchant marine victory vessel. They were in support of the military and all of our wars. The merchant marine has helped supply ship supplies and troops and everything else. Well, in December of 1950, and remember, November was when the rush of the Chinese military across the Yalu River. In 1950, there were 100,000 troops that needed to be evacuated by sea, and they put together 193 ships to evacuate these 100,000 UN soldiers. Well, one of the last ships, as they were loading, the problem really was that various of the civilians, the Korean civilians, were also fleeing from the North Korean communists and from the Chinese communists. So, equal to the 100,000 soldiers that showed up, there was pretty much the same number of civilians who came to the port and wanted to be able to leave on board these boats. Well, once they had loaded up most of the ships, one of the last ships there was the SS Meredith Victory. The SS Meredith Victory was loaded with supplies and weapons. The captain of the ship, Captain Leonard LaRue, decided that they would unload all of their supplies and all of their weapons. They quite literally, after this, had no means to defend themselves, in order to put as many of the Korean civilians on board the ship as possible. This is a ship that was intended to have, a crew of 40-some and room for 12 passengers. They managed to load 14,000 Korean civilians aboard this ship, so many that they couldn't sit down. They literally were forced to stand up. They had very little food, very little water, but the reports are that the Korean civilians were very stoic about this. They didn't complain, and again, they were so tightly packed into this ship that they were shoulder to shoulder and could not even sit down. They ended up having to, and it was freezing weather. We're talking about December in North Korea, northern part of North Korea, and so It was freezing weather. It took them 3 days and nights to reach Busan, but they were unable to unload at Busan. They had to travel one more day, so that from the night of the 20th and the morning, I'm sorry, the night of the 21st and the morning of the 22nd until the Christmas Day, the people were forced to stay aboard the ship. They finally were able to go to Goeje Island before they could disembark. This is, according to the Guinness Book of Records, this is the largest evacuation from land by a single ship in history. It has been called by the Transportation Commission the greatest rescue in the history of mankind. The people, the crew involved in this were given numerous citations. They as from the Merchant Marine, from the government of China, or Korea, excuse me. Interestingly enough, the current president of South Korea, Moon Jae-il, his parents were on board this ship. And so he's had that association. The fascinating part of this, and I should say that Leonard LaRue, after he resigned his position in the Merchant Marine, he became a Benedictine monk. And there is now an effort being mounted to try to have him sainted, because it was his efforts, his command that led to doing that. And they say that during this trip, in much of it in enemy-controlled waters, etc., the only weapon they had on board was the pistol he had in his pocket. So it was an extraordinary act of faith. The very interesting part about this is that on board our ship, we currently have one of the deck crew from the Meredith Victory that was involved in this evacuation. So let me introduce to you Burley Smith. Now, Mr. Smith is here with several other guests that are involved in this, and they're going to be having some meetings and events in Busan while we're here in Korea about the efforts to try to achieve or to move the process forward for sainthood for Captain LaRue. And tomorrow night at 9 o'clock here in the show lounge, they will be having a special presentation. I understand there's a film involved, and then they will have several people speaking. Mr. Smith will be speaking. They'll also have Ned Forney, a historian and grandson of a Marine colonel that was in charge of the Hungnam beachhead. Hungnam was where they evacuated them from. Father Andre Lee, and also D.H. Wan, who was a teenage refugee at that point, and Burley Smith will be speaking. So you're all invited here. If you are aboard ship or if you're staying in Busan, we unfortunately are going to the overnight to Seoul, or we would definitely be here. So you can come and hear more about this extraordinary event during the Korean War, where the Meredith Victory performed the largest evacuation and all Korean civilians ever in history. Okay, so we're very grateful to the work that you did, Mr. Smith, and thank you for that. So come tomorrow night and hear more about this. Is there anything you would care to say?
No, there are probably a lot of you here who are of an age to remember the Korean War very well. There were 3 of us on the ship, 2 engineering officers and myself, and mate, who were just out of school, literally a week when the war started in June of 1950. So this was our first job as officers. We'd been in school for 4 years at the Merchant Marine Academy. And it was an amazing trip. One of the things that Ross didn't mention was all of these 14,000 were North Korean. So what we were doing, our military had decided, the Chinese had said as they were coming in that any boys 12 years of age or older that weren't helping the North Koreans and the Chinese would be beheaded as the Chinese arrived. So this forced a lot of the Korean families in the north to start flooding out with our troops down to the Hungnam beachhead. And the remarkable thing about it, they've called it the Ship of Miracles. I think the miracles, as we'll go into tomorrow night, is that the North Koreans, in rags, the majority of them, with no food, no water, trusted we foreigners in these open ships to get them out of North Korea. They left their homes. My wife, Barbara, and I, a week ago in Florida, where we lived, had dinner with a Korean refugee we hadn't met before. And his family was from on land. And his father took him down to the ships and said, "Goodbye, son. Get out of town. This is no place for any of you youngsters." And this occurred thousands and thousands of times. So it's a fascinating story, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from the grandson of the Marine Colonel who got all the refugees organized. And one of the refugees was Juan. He now lives in Ohio. We've got him coming tomorrow night. And I haven't met the Korean priest, Father Lee, who lives in Busan. He'll be coming to tell us more about the sacred effort that the Catholic Church is
Wonderful.
I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night. Lots of stories. 5 babies born on board. At first I hoped that we'd have 2 of them come to the meeting tomorrow. I'm not sure they're going to make it. We didn't know what to name them, so they were all named 1 through 5.
And there was no doctor on board, so thank you very much. So apparently they had one crew member who had some first aid training, and he was responsible for delivering babies. But yeah, the situation of the North Koreans running from North Korean and Chinese troops, this is something that happened regularly. In fact, once the peace treaty or the peace negotiations started, they never did have a peace treaty. One of the problems they kept running into is that the captured North Korean soldiers that the South had did not want to go back north. And so they were not willing to force them to go back, but North Korea would not proceed with the peace negotiations unless they were promised that all of their even unwilling soldiers would be sent back. And every expectation was that they would be killed if they were sent back, because they were not supportive of the North Korean regime. So thank you, Mr. Smith. We appreciate that. Do come tomorrow night. I can't talk about Korea without talking about Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, and I'm very much of a mixed mind about Douglas MacArthur as someone who has studied history extensively. Some of the things that he did were extraordinary. I think that the sensitivity that he used as the senior commander of the Allied powers in Japan is one reason why that transition of the Allied powers who won over a very proud enemy, many of whom did not want to surrender, were willing to fight to the death, is because of how he handled the emperor and some other things there. There are other ways in which I'm not a big fan of Douglas MacArthur. He seemed a little bit too inclined to, want the cameras to be rolling before he did things. And yet, he is one of the most decorated soldiers ever. He received the Medal of Honor and was nominated for a second Medal of Honor. He had 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 7 Silver Stars, and that flight over the front lines near the Yalu River, where he looked from his plane and said, it doesn't look like we have a problem, we don't need to do anything. And then short time after that, the Chinese came rushing across the border. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross with wings for that, even though that ended up being something that was quite an embarrassment to him. And so he certainly was involved in every major campaign from the First World War on, and was a significant player. He's one of only 5 military officers that ever achieved the rank of General of the Army, which is what you call a 5-star general. It's Brigadier General, Major General, Lieutenant General, and then General, and then General of the Army. So only 5 people have ever been named General of the Army, and he was one of them. Well, he had been commander of the U.S. forces in the Far East, and then he was forced off of Corregidor. Well, he was ordered off Corregidor, to be fair. And then he came back to the Philippines. He ended up being the one that received the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri. He took over as the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in Japan, and as I say, I think he did an extraordinary job at that. He had the right balance between strength and sensitivity. But when the Korean conflict began to occur, and technically it's not a war, it was never declared as a war. This is the first time in history that the United States got involved in a major conflict without the president getting an approval to declare war from the Congress. And there's always been issues. They introduced the term in the United Nations, a police action. which was very difficult for, I think, veterans of Korea to take, that they weren't acknowledged as having been involved in a real war. It was a police action. My father was in Korea, by the way. And yet Douglas MacArthur proved himself brave in many ways. In fact, after the Incheon landing, he was out examining some Russian T-34 tanks that the Marines had disabled, that were dead, and there were snipers shooting at him. And he didn't seem to be bothered by that at all, even though the bullets were pinging off of the tanks around him. And his only response to that was, it appears that the North Korean snipers are not well trained, So you have to give him credit for some personal bravery. But throughout this whole thing, he disagreed with President Truman and did not like the official policy. Now, Truman gave the initial orders for the landing, approved Incheon, and then ordered Douglas MacArthur and the troops to go north across the 38th parallel into North Korea. But once they got pushed back again and they got back to the 38th parallel, MacArthur was just terrifically anxious to launch another assault, to the extent that he was prepared. He wanted Truman to approve the use of nationalist Chinese soldiers who were on Taiwan now. Remember, they were the guys that lost in the Chinese Civil War, not the communists, but the Kuomintang. He also, while officially denying it, he communicated to people, and it was later confirmed, that he was in favor of using nuclear weapons against North Korea and against the Chinese. There were also confidential communiques that he made to foreign embassies that were allies of ours, particularly Spain and Portugal, that he would assure, he promised them, that he would bring Red China, Communist China, into this war so that we could finally get rid of a major communist power. All of this was directly in contradiction to the instructions he was receiving from the Supreme Commander of the military, which is the President of the United States. Eventually, for all of that, and Truman asked him to come back to the States for meetings, and he refused. He would only come as far as Wake Island to meet with the President. So Truman accused him of insubordination unofficially. To officially have accused him of insubordination would have required a general court-martial, and who knew what would happen in that. So Truman, after a long period of time, and with the support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, removed MacArthur from his position in 1951. And so at that point, MacArthur was so popular in the American Congress and amongst the American people that it plummeted Truman's support numbers. In fact, until quite recently, there was a period there where Truman had the lowest approval numbers of any president. We've beaten that since then. But in fact, that's why Truman chose not to run for another term. And Dwight Eisenhower was elected as a Republican to president. And he had said in campaigning, Eisenhower had said that if I'm elected, I will go to Korea and solve this problem. I will bring an end to this. And after he was elected as president-elect, he did go to Korea. And they had been having peace talks at that point since June of 1951. Of course, Eisenhower was elected later that year. And the USSR had actually proposed the peace talks. Again, Stalin's playing both sides of everything here. And the peace talks had gone on again, off again. And the biggest sticking point was that the UN negotiators were not willing to agree to send back to the North the North Korean prisoners they had who didn't want to go back, who felt like if they were in danger if they went back. So on again, off again. When President Eisenhower, in November of 1952, went to Korea, and he clearly indicated that if they could not find a solution, and it was only a hint, but it was a clear hint, that nuclear weapons were not completely out of the question. Then they figured out a way to find a peace agreement, or not a peace agreement, but at least an armistice. And so, on the 27th of July of 1953, they did sign an armistice. Again, it is not a peace treaty. All it means it's a ceasefire agreement. There has never been a peace treaty signed over the Korean conflict. So technically it was not a war because it was not declared. Technically it is still going on because there has never been a peace treaty signed by it. Immediately after the end of active hostilities, North Korea executed every educated person in North Korea who they thought might in any way possibly lead opposition. They had a purge that they estimate killed 100,000 people. You see why the North Korean soldiers didn't want to be sent back if they were captured? It's also true that over a period of time, I talked about briefly how North Korea has not done as well, and we all know that. They have suffered from famines. Even though they got huge support from the Soviet Union, from the Eastern Bloc countries, and from China, they have not handled it very well, and the people have suffered from famine, from malnutrition, and that was proven because a study was done in China, interestingly, of North Korean young men, that is, young adults, average age 17 or 18, that have come to China, and they are on average 5 inches shorter than the equivalent aged young men in South Korea. And it's because of malnutrition. You know, if you don't have the nutrients, you don't grow. And so they ran into the proof of that in Japan and published those results. In the Korean conflict, an estimated 54,000 Americans were killed, but 1 million Chinese and 3 million Koreans died in this conflict. Today, the most obvious evidence of the Korean conflict is, of course, the demilitarized zone. This is a zone that the 38th parallel is straight. This roughly follows it because the geography sort of forces that. The demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, is 160 miles long, or 250 kilometers. It averages 2.5 miles wide, or 4 kilometers wide. It is on each side, there are various kinds of barriers. They have chain link fence topped with barbed wire. They have raked sand areas so that anybody who tries to sneak over, they can see, you know, footprints in the sand or can see them. They then have a kill zone which has mines and various tripwires. There are interlocking machine guns and mortars and artillery. There are observation towers, and there are always quick reaction forces that are prepared to respond immediately in case of any effort to try to violate this demilitarized zone. There have been many flare-ups where people being shot, high-powered rifles across this. There was a major event that happened in the 60s where there was a tree that was blocking the sight of some of the South Korean observers. So they went out, it was on their side, but they went out to cut this tree down. Well, the North Koreans attacked them across the line and killed a number of the soldiers who were out there to cut down a tree. And so that almost restarted the Korean War. I mean, that was as blatant, we've had a lot of blatant things. There are 4 tunnels that the North Koreans have tried to dig underneath the DMZ in order to have access for invasion, or to get troops across to do whatever. And in each case, they found them. There may be others, but they found the first 4, and they're aware of that as a real danger. I mentioned this before, that Seoul, Korea, there are more long-distance weapons, missiles, artillery shells, anything you can imagine aimed at Seoul, Korea, more than any other place on Earth. And the North Koreans have promised, if there ever is a violation, if you ever do anything to offend us, if we ever get any scent that you are going to get aggressive with us, then we will blow Seoul off the map. So how many of you are going with us to Seoul? Great, we'll all be together. This is interesting. This flagpole, which is a North Korean flagpole, it is at the Kijongdong, which is near Panmunjom on the North Korean side, is the 4th tallest flagpole in the world. It's 160 meters tall. They want to make sure we know they're still there, I guess. So this is the Korean War. I talked a little bit before about, I don't think I have any, no, I don't. About the results. North Korea has struggled terribly with famine, with malnutrition. Their economy is in terrible shape. And yet they claim, their leaders claim that they are the paradise on earth, and that everybody else hates them because they're doing so well and everybody else is doing so poorly. The population of North Korea, they were close to even when, at the time of the war. Population of South Korea is now 50 million, North Korea is only 25 million. And as I say, they're a lot shorter because they have not had the nutrition that's available in the South. So it's a very different kind of situation. Any questions about the Korean War? Yes?
We were on a tour today, and our guide said that they have many Chinese tourists. This year, there aren't as many, she said, because of a political situation. And do you know what that...
A political situation, well, I don't know for a fact.
She said it was something about North Korea.
Right, well, the question is that their guide today had said something about they used to have a lot more Chinese tourists, they're not getting as many now because of a political situation. And what is that? Well, Kim Jong-un just took an armored train from Pyongyang, from their capital, to Beijing and met with the senior authorities in Beijing. It may very well be that this is an indication that the Chinese government, they're the premier there, that they're looking into closer relations with North Korea. I don't know that, but this is the first time he's ever gone anywhere to meet with anyone. And if that's the case, then it might be that would cause Chinese to be less likely to be coming to South Korea if the Chinese government is indicating a desire to develop more relations with North Korea. I don't know that for a fact, but that's the only thing I know of that could possibly relate to that. Does anybody else have any information on that? Yes? Oh. Okay. Teresa, what's your question?
Why do you think Stalin waited at the 38th parallel with the U.S. arrived?
Oh, why did Stalin wait at the 38th parallel when nobody really expected him to, when he could have just marched on further south? I think it relates to the fact that Stalin was very concerned. I mean, they had developed a nuclear weapon then, but they didn't really have the tactical delivery systems or anything yet. I mean, he didn't have as much fear because they had exploded a nuclear device and they had the technology to develop that, which they did. But I think that Stalin was, he was concerned that he had to at least play the game a little bit with the Allies. This is Britain and the United States primarily, but other allies as well. But he couldn't just blatantly violate the things he promised and that publicly people were aware of, lest he lose prestige and he begin to lose influence. There's always this very sensitive, balanced game of brinksmanship, where on the one hand you have to look strong, but on the other hand, if it appears you can't be trusted by anyone, then you don't accomplish anything. And I think Stalin found himself in that. He was one of the best at that game. I mean, he was brilliant at it. He took over half of Europe before anybody realized it. Winston Churchill was perhaps the only major leader who had any idea what Stalin's intentions were. FDR trusted him. And so I think at this point, we don't know exactly what was going through Stalin's mind, but part of it had to do with the fact that he clearly did not want to find himself in a shooting war with the United States, and he may have thought that could have caused it, because there was an agreement that, that we were going to share responsibility. And he probably thought, why create a war now when I can get what I want later through manipulation? Question over here?
Just to comment on that. The
Yes.
reason why that happened is that, a year ago when they started all this nuclear, proliferation on the North Korea, all these missiles. So the United States, at the request of the Korean government, put some anti-aircraft missiles, some put the weaponry on the South Korea.
Right.
Very much upset the Chinese. So the Chinese made economic sanctions
Right.
against South Korea. And one of the reasons why we didn't go to Dalian is that they are not anymore allowed any cruise ships going on from China to go directly to South Korea. That's why we went to Karatsu before and then going back.
Right.
Check, going through these trades a couple times more than we should do.
Yeah, and that's
why one of the economic measures was they cut, because all the tourism in China is government sponsored. Chinese people cannot go without getting permission from the government, so they don't give them permission to go, that's it.
right. And so it's a balance. I mean, there's always this balancing act.
He's
answering her
Sorry,
question.
he was saying that because of South Korea's relationship with the United States and because of the potential of placing weaponry, that China had put economic sanctions on South Korea and was making gestures of relationship to North Korea. And again, it's always that balance sort of thing. Like, okay, if you, whoever, you know, if you're the Soviet Union or China, if the United States is doing something in their neighborhood that they don't like or they're afraid where it might go, then they will take action that to sort of counterbalance that by some other, and in this case, it would be North Korea, especially since they have been testing missiles and there's always those kind of threats. And so they are encouraging a relationship with North Korea in order to punish South Korea and indirectly to, you know...
What did that have to do with
It had to do with your question about
Yeah, why are Chinese tourists
why
not
the
coming? It's
Chinese
because the
people aren't
government of
coming.
China is developing more of a relationship with North Korea and has put sanctions against South Korea, and that maybe that the Chinese travel permits and things like that to South Korea are not being allowed now.